That fence comes down by Friday, or we take it down for you, and we bill you for the labor." Those were the first words Diane Walcott ever said to me that mattered. And she said them standing on my own gravel, looking at a cedar fence line my father had set with his own hands 40 years before she ever bought a lot in our valley. She was the president of the Pinecrest Ridge Homeowners Association. 3 years into a presidency, she treated like a county seat. And the fence she wanted gone ran along the western edge of my 11 acres up against the National Forest boundary. What she did not know, what she never once bothered to check in the 18 months she spent trying to take 8 feet of my land, was that the fence was not on the line she thought it was. The fence was 8 feet inside my own property, set back on purpose, and the strip she was claiming belonged to no homeowner at all. It was a recorded utility and access easement, and I had the plat, the deed, and the original survey stakes that proved every inch of it. If a woman in pearls and white sneakers walked onto your ground and told you your father built his fence in the wrong place, would you argue with her? Or would you let her keep talking until she said it in front of the right people? My name is Tom Reardon. I was 61 years old that spring, a retired land surveyor who spent 34 years walking property lines for the county and the private firms after that. And the place she wanted a piece of was the parcel my father bought in 1968, 11 acres on the western shoulder of Pinecrest Ridge, pine and rock and a meadow that still ran with snowmelt in May. I knew that ground the way you know the inside of your own hands. I had walked every foot of it as a boy behind my father, who carried a Brunton compass in his coat pocket the way other men carried a pocket knife. And I had walked it again as a licensed man with a transit and a steel chain. And there was not a corner of it I could not have found in the dark. My wife Carol and I raised our family there. We were married 36 years. She grew tomatoes against the south wall of the barn, and she kept a row of mason jars on the kitchen windowsill that caught the morning light. And she had a way of putting her hand flat on the middle of my back when I came in angry from a job that took the heat right out of me. Carol passed 4 years before Diane ever knocked. A stroke, fast, in the kitchen, on an ordinary Sunday. I buried a good part of myself with her. But I kept the land the way she kept her kitchen, which is to say nothing left its place without a reason. The jars are still on the windowsill. I have never moved them. My daughter Beth had moved back home after the funeral with her boy, my grandson Sam, who was 14 that spring and already taller than his mother. Beth worked the front desk at the vet clinic in town, and Sam was the kind of quiet, watchful kid who notices everything and says about a third of it. We had a dog named Gus, a blue heeler with one milky eye who slept across the back door like a dropped coat, and who had appointed himself the official inspector of anyone who came up the drive. That was the household Diane Walcott decided was standing in the way of her plans. 3 generations and a one-eyed dog on 11 acres my father paid for with 30 years of work. And she looked at all of it and saw 8 feet of fence in the wrong place. I want to be plain about something before I go on. I am not a man who looks for a fight. I spent my whole working life being the person both sides trusted to tell them where the truth was. The surveyor whose stakes ended arguments instead of starting them. When the first letter came, I did not get angry. I got out a folder. The first letter came on a Tuesday in March. It was on Pinecrest Ridge letterhead, and it informed me that my western fence was in violation of the community boundary standards and encroached on common area by approximately 8 feet. It gave me 30 days to remove it. I read it twice at my kitchen table while Gus thumped his tail against the floor. And then I did the thing I have done my whole life. I wrote the date on the top corner, I made a copy, and I put the original in a clean manila folder labeled with one word in black marker: Pinecrest. Here is what I knew that Diane did not. There was no common area along my western line. The forest boundary ran behind my property, federal ground, and between my fence and the forest sat a 50-foot recorded easement that the original developer had dedicated in 1971 for utility and emergency access. I knew this because I had surveyed half the lots in Pinecrest Ridge myself over the years, and because my father had walked that easement with the developer when the ink was still wet. The fence Diane wanted torn down was not even touching the disputed ground. It sat 8 feet inside my own deeded line, on my side, where my father had set it back deliberately so the easement would stay clear. Diane had looked at a fence, decided it was in the wrong place, and never once pulled the plat that would have told her the truth in 30 seconds. I drove down to her house that first week, before any of it got ugly, because that is what a reasonable man does. The Walcott place sat at the top of the development, a big timber and stone thing with a circular drive and a fountain that ran even in March, and a vanity plate on the SUV in the driveway that read, Rugline. Diane answered the door in a pink quilted vest with a clipboard already in her hand, as if she had been expecting to take notes on me. She had a sharp blonde bob and a pair of sunglasses pushed up on the crown of her head and a string of pearls she wore the way some men wear a badge. I told her, calm as I could, holding my hat, that I thought there had been a mistake, that my fence was inside my own line, and that I would be glad to come back with the survey and walk it with her any morning she liked. She looked at me the way you look at a man trying to sell you a magazine subscription. Mr. Reardon, the association has standards, and those standards apply to every parcel that is functionally part of our community, she said. She did not invite me in, bite me. She did not look at the hat in my hands. Your fence reads as encroachment from the road, and perception is what governs property values here. I would suggest you comply rather than complicate this. I said the offer to walk it stood. I said it twice. She told me the association did not need to walk anything, that the matter was already clear, and that compliance walkthroughs were scheduled at the board's discretion and not at a homeowner's convenience. Then she said the word again, the one I would come to know like a tooth that aches. Functionally. My parcel was functionally part of her community, she said, the way the river is functionally part of the valley, and a functional community has the right to maintain its boundaries. Functionally part of our community. I would hear that phrase from her a dozen times over the next year and a half, and every time she said it, I thought about the word functionally, which is the word people use when they cannot say legally. My parcel was not in Pinecrest Ridge. It predated the subdivision by 3 years. My father's land had never been platted into the association, never signed a covenant, never paid a due. Diane had simply decided that because my driveway met their road, I belonged to her. I thanked her for her time and put my hat back on and drove home, and Gus met me at the gate and put his nose in my hand, and I sat in the truck a minute before I went inside. Then I added a single line to my legal pad. First contact. Refused to look at survey. And I want you to understand that this was the moment I stopped expecting reason and started keeping a record. Because I had learned across 34 years that the difference between losing your land and keeping it is almost never who is right. It is who can prove it. So I built the binder. I want to tell you how, because it matters more than any clever thing I did later. I drove the 40 minutes to the county recorder's office on a Monday morning, and I pulled my own copy of the recorded plat from 1971. The one with the easement dedication stamped on it in the corner. And I paid the $11 for a certified copy, and I watched the clerk press the seal into it. I pulled my father's deed, recorded in 1968, with the meets and bounds that put my western line a full 8 feet east of where Diane was pointing. I read those meets and bounds out loud to myself in the truck in the parking lot, the bearings and the distances, the way my father taught me to read them. And they said exactly what I knew they would say. Then I went home and dug the original survey field notes out of my own files, because I had rewalked that line myself in 2004 and driven fresh iron pins at the corners, and I had the notes in my own hand and the coordinates in my own ledger. The next morning, I took a tape and a camera out to the western line, and I found every pin. The northwest corner pin was right where I had left it 20 years before. The red plastic cap faded almost white, 8 feet east of the fence on the forest side. I knelt in the wet grass, and I laid the tape from the pin to the fence, and I photographed the tape with the numbers showing. And I photographed the pin, and I did the same at the southwest corner. I labeled every page in the binder with a date and a description in block letters, the way I had labeled 10,000 pages across my career. And then I waited, because I knew Diane Walcott was the kind of person who could not stand to be ignored, and that she would keep climbing. I knew it the way you know weather coming. A man who keeps records learns to recognize a person who keeps grudges. She did not disappoint me. The second letter came in April, and it was a fine, $250 for continued non-compliance, with a notice that the amount would compound weekly. I did not pay it. I could not pay it, because you cannot owe a fine to an association you do not belong to. But more than that, paying it would have been an admission that she had jurisdiction over my ground, and I was not going to hand her that for $250 or for any number. I filed the letter. Fine number 1. In May, she sent a man. He showed up on a Thursday morning in a polo shirt with a little embroidered Pinecrest crest on the chest, carrying a clipboard and a measuring wheel, and wearing a lanyard with a laminated card that said, "Compliance Inspector," in letters big enough to read from the porch. He parked his truck across the mouth of my drive, and he started walking my western fence line with the wheel, on my side of the fence, without knocking, without asking, clicking off footage like he was measuring a sidewalk. Gus went after him low and fast the way a heeler does. No bark until he was already moving. And the man backed up to the gate fast enough to drop his clipboard in the gravel. I came out wiping my hands on a rag, and I asked him who he was and what he thought he was doing on my property. "Authorized boundary inspection," he said, picking up his clipboard, keeping the gate between himself and the dog. "On behalf of the Pinecrest Ridge Homeowners Association." I asked him to show me his surveyor's license. In our state, you cannot legally measure and certify a property boundary unless you are a licensed surveyor. And I knew the answer before I asked it, because a licensed man does not park across another man's drive and start clicking a wheel without a word. He blinked at me. He said he was conducting a visual and dimensional assessment, not a survey, as if those were different things when the wheel was already laying down numbers on his clipboard. I asked him his name. He told me it was Rick. I asked Rick what he charged. He said the association paid him $40 an hour. He was a handyman in a lanyard. I told him to get off my land and to tell Diane that the next person who crossed my gate without permission would be talking to the sheriff, and that I had just watched an unlicensed man attempt to measure a boundary, which was its own kind of trouble he might want to look up. He left without another word. I wrote it down. First trespass. Unlicensed individual measuring boundary, paid by association. And I took a photograph of his truck and the plate as he backed out, and saved it to 2 drives, the way I save everything. That was the spring it became clear to me that this was not about a fence. Because here is the thing about Diane Walcott that I had not yet understood. She was not just a busybody with a clipboard. Her husband was a man named Greg Walcott. and Greg ran a development company called Ridgeline Partners. And Ridgeline had spent 2 years quietly buying up the undeveloped lots on the western edge of Pinecrest Ridge, the lots that backed up against the forest. I learned this slowly, the way you learn most true things, by paying attention. I learned it from a neighbor named Frank Delgado, a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 lots down, a wiry man with reading glasses on a cord, and an old habit of fact-checking everything anyone told him, who had no more love for Diane than I did. Frank flagged me down at the mailboxes one evening in the long light after supper. He had served on the architectural committee for 1 year and quit, he told me, because he did not like the way decisions were being made before the meetings instead of in them. He leaned on my truck and he told me, quiet, that Ridgeline had filed for a preliminary plat to build 12 high-end cabins along the western boundary, and that the whole project depended on road access and a utility run that had to cross, of all places, the 50-foot easement behind my property. The easement Diane was pretending was common area, the easement that my fence was set back to protect. Frank took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and he said, "Tom, I do not think she cares one bit about your fence. I think she cares about the 8 feet behind it." I went home and pulled the easement dedication out of the binder and read the conditions on it again under the kitchen light. And the more I read, the more the whole shape of it came clear. Suddenly, the 8 feet made sense. If Diane could establish that the strip behind my fence was association common area, then the association, which her husband effectively controlled through a board he had stacked with friends, could grant Ridgeline an access agreement across it. If she had to admit it was a recorded utility easement with conditions on it, the math on Greg's 12 cabins got a lot harder. My fence was not in her way because it looked bad from the road. It was in her way because a careful man had set it 8 feet back 40 years ago. And that 8 feet was the difference between Greg Walcott's project penciling out and not. I did not say any of this to Diane. I did not say it to anyone but Frank and my own legal pad. I just kept filing. The summer was a staircase, and I counted every step. In June, the association recorded a lien against my property for the unpaid fines, which by then they claimed had reached $1,100. A lien on a parcel that was not in their association, recorded in the same county office where my father's deed had sat for 56 years. I filed the notice of it, and I called a real estate attorney named Susan Pruitt, who I had testified for as a survey expert a few times over the years, and who I trusted to tell me the truth instead of the bill. She came out to the house on a Saturday and spread my plat and my deed across the kitchen table next to Carol's mason jars. And she read them for about 10 minutes with one finger moving along the bearings. And then she looked up at me over her glasses and said, "Tom, they have no standing to do any of this, and the lien itself may be slander of title." I asked her what I should do. She told me to keep documenting, to not pay $1, and to let them keep building the case for me. She tapped the binder, and she used a phrase I have never forgotten. She said, "The best thing you can do is give them enough rope and make sure there is a camera on the tree." She told me not to file suit yet, not to fire the first shot, because a clean record kept by a calm man was worth more in front of a judge than any complaint I could file in anger. Leanne recorded. That was June. In July, they came for my customers. I had not fully retired. I still did small survey jobs for old clients, boundary stakeouts, the occasional expert review, and I ran them out of a little office in the corner of my barn with a drafting table and a plotter and 40 years of filed jobs in steel cabinets. In July, a longtime client named Dale Hutchins called me, embarrassed, his voice doing that thing a proud man's voice does when he has to deliver bad news he is ashamed to be the carrier of. Dale said he had gotten a letter from Pinecrest Ridge, warning him that I was operating an illegal commercial business in a residential community, and that anyone contracting with me could be named in association enforcement actions. "Tom," he said, "I know it is garbage. I have known you 20 years. I just thought you should know they are mailing it around to people." He was the third client to tell me that week. 3 intimidation letters to my customers that I knew of. I got copies of the ones I could, and I filed all 3, and I added them to the binder. And that night, I sat at the kitchen table a long time with my hand flat on that folder. Because going after a man's livelihood is a different thing than going after his fence. And I felt the anger come up in my chest like heat off a stove. The kind of anger that wants to get in a truck and drive somewhere and say something a man cannot take back. Beth came in from the late shift and saw my face across the kitchen and set down her keys and asked me what was wrong. I told her all of it, the lien and the letters and Dale's voice on the phone. And she said the thing that I think saved me from doing something foolish that summer. She leaned against the counter where her mother used to stand, and she said, "Dad, you taught me that the stakes in the ground don't care how mad anybody is. Let the stakes do the talking." I looked at my daughter, standing in Carol's spot, saying a thing I had said to her 100 times when she was small, and the heat went out of my chest the way it used to when Carol put her hand on my back. So I did what she said. I let the stakes do the talking. In August, Diane stood up at the regular monthly association meeting in the rec center off the main road, in front of 40 homeowners in folding chairs. Frank was there in the back and recorded the whole thing on his phone, propped against a coffee urn so it would not shake. Diane stood at the front in a magenta blazer with her clipboard, and she called me out by name. She said the Reardon parcel was a blight on the community, that I was a hostile holdout obstructing improvements that would raise everyone's home values, and that the board was prepared to pursue every legal remedy to bring my property into compliance. "That parcel is functionally part of our jurisdiction," she said, "and Mr. Reardon's refusal to cooperate is costing every family in this room money." There was applause from people who had no idea their applause was being recorded. People who trusted the woman with the clipboard because she sounded certain, and certainty is easy to mistake for truth. That was the second time she said it where it counted, in front of witnesses, on tape. Frank's phone got all of it, the words and the applause both. And he sent it to me that night with one line: "Saved to 2 places, just like you taught me." He had been listening when I talked over the fence. People listen more than you think. By September, the fines they claimed I owed had crossed $4,000. The lien was still recorded against my title, and I had a binder 2 inches thick with a date in the corner of every page. And then Diane made the move that took the whole thing out of the category of petty harassment and put it squarely into the category of a crime. It was a Wednesday morning, the second Wednesday in September, a little after 8. Beth had already left for the early shift, and Sam was inside getting ready for school. And I was out in the barn squaring up a drafting job when I heard the chains and the engine, and then a sound I knew in my bones. The bite of a chainsaw going into cedar. I came around the corner of the barn at a walk that wanted badly to be a run. And there were 3 men at my western gate with bolt cutters and a chainsaw and a flatbed trailer backed up onto my gravel. And the gate to my own driveway was already cut and lying flat in the dirt. And they were starting on the fence. My father's fence. The cedar he had split and set by hand the year I turned 12. There was a man in a Ridgeline Partners vest standing back from the crew, directing them with a rolled-up set of papers and a stack of documents on the hood of the truck that I would later learn was a forged removal authorization with a county seal photocopied off a real permit. I did not run at them. I want you to know that, because everything in me wanted to. I had a 14-year-old in the house and a dog that would have gone straight at 3 strangers with a chainsaw and ended up shot or charged. And I had spent 34 years learning that the man who keeps his head is the man who keeps his land. I leaned in the back door and I told Sam to hold Gus inside by the collar and not to come out. And he looked at the men over my shoulder and his face went tight. But he took the dog and he did exactly what I asked. Then I took out my phone and I started recording. And I walked to within 20 feet of the crew, no closer. And I said, in a voice I kept as level as the bubble in a hand level, "You are on private property. You are destroying private property. I am recording this, and I have already called the sheriff." The man in the ridgeline vest turned around. "The association authorized this removal," he said. "Diane Walcott signed off on it personally. You got a problem, you take it up with the board. We are cleared to be here." I asked him to show me the permit. He jerked his chin at the papers on the hood. I photographed them from where I stood, the whole stack, the seal, the signature line, without touching one page. I asked him his name and the name of his company, and he gave me both because he still believed the paper on the hood made him safe. And I kept recording while they cut 3 more posts, the saw screaming and the cedar coming down in the grass my father had planted, because every second of that video was another foot of rope. And I had promised an attorney and a dead wife and a daughter standing in her mother's spot that I would let the record do what my temper could not. The deputy who came was named Carl Okafor, and I had known Carl a little for years, the way you know people in a small county. Carl was a careful man, and when he got out of his truck, he did exactly what a constrained, honest officer is supposed to do. He did not take my side. He listened to the ridgeline man, who produced the papers from the hood. He listened to me. Then he told both of us that he had a destruction of property complaint and a counterclaim of trespass, and that the work would stop right now until the paperwork could be verified, and that nobody was cutting one more post. He told the crew to load up and leave. And before he left, he said to me, "Low, off to the side, Mr. Reardon. If that authorization turns out to be no good, this stops being a civil matter real fast." He told me to gather everything I had. I told him I had been gathering for 6 months. He almost smiled. "I want to slow down here, because this next part is the part that mattered. And it did not happen with shouting. The county verified the removal authorization within 48 hours. It was forged. The permit number on it belonged to a culvert replacement on the other side of the county, and the county seal had been photocopied. Forging a county permit is a felony, and presenting it to justify destroying someone's property is a second crime stacked on the first." Deputy Okafor opened a criminal file. The ridgeline man who had directed the crew gave a statement to save himself and named the person who had handed him the authorization and told him the association had cleared it. That person was Diane Walcott. The thing that ended it, the thing that ended all of it, did not happen in a patrol car. It happened 3 weeks later in the County Planning Commission hearing room, on the night Ridgeline Partners' 12-cabin development was up for its preliminary plat approval. The room was full. Greg Walcott was there in a good gray suit with his lawyer beside him, and a presentation board on an easel showing 12 cabins drawn in soft pencil along a curving private road. Diane was there in the magenta blazer, sitting in the front row with her chin up, the way she sat in every room. The project depended entirely on access across the strip behind my property, and the staff report in the commissioner's folders described that strip as Association Common Area available for dedication. Diane had told the staff that. Greg had told them that. Nobody had pulled the dedication, and I was there, in the back row in a clean shirt, with my binder closed on my lap. When the public comment period opened, I walked to the podium. I did not give a speech. I have heard men give speeches in those rooms my whole career and watched them lose to a single piece of paper held by somebody calmer. I told the commission my name and that I owned the 11-acre parcel adjoining the western boundary. And then I stopped talking and I laid 3 things on the table in front of them, one at a time, so each one landed before the next. I laid down the recorded plat from 1971 with the easement dedication stamped on it. I laid down my father's deed from 1968, the meets and bounds putting my western line 8 feet east of the fence. And I laid down my own certified survey from 2004, with the iron pins photographed in the ground next to the tape, showing that my fence sat 8 feet inside my deeded line, and that the strip behind it was not common area at all, but a recorded 50-foot utility and access easement with a condition written into the dedication. The condition was the part nobody had read in 50 years. The easement could not be encumbered or built upon without the written consent of every adjoining deeded owner. I said that out loud, slow once. I was an adjoining deeded owner. I had never given consent, and I never would. Then I stepped back from the podium, and I did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The paper was on the table. I let it sit there in the quiet. The chairman of the commission was a woman named Helen Vasquez, a former county engineer who knew how to read a plat the way I know how to read one. She pulled the documents toward her, and she put on her glasses, and she read them, all 3, taking her time, her finger tracking the bearings on the survey the way Susan Pruitt's had tracked them at my kitchen table. The room got very quiet. Greg's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Diane shifted in her chair. Helen Vasquez read the dedication condition twice. Then she looked up, not at me, but down the row at Greg Walcott, and she asked him a single question in the flat, even voice of a person who already knows the answer. She asked whether his access agreement carried the written consent of the adjoining easement owners. Greg looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the table. Greg looked at Diane. And Diane, who had said the word functionally in my driveway and at her own front door and in front of 40 applauding neighbors, looked down at the floor and said nothing at all. The silence went on long enough that a man in the second row coughed. Then Helen Vasquez squared the 3 documents into a neat stack and set them at the edge of her bench, and she said, in the voice of someone closing a folder for good, "Then this body cannot act on an application that depends on access the applicant does not have. This item is tabled." She struck the agenda line with her pen. Nobody shouted. The deed did the talking, the way I had always known it would. The numbers are what I want you to hold on to, because the numbers are the whole story. In 18 months, Diane Walcott had recorded against my property fines she eventually claimed totaled $4,200. She had filed 1 fraudulent lien. She had sent 3 letters to my clients. She had authorized 1 act of criminal destruction on a forged county permit. And in all of that, the number she collected from me was 0. Not $250, not 8 feet. 0. The fence my father set in 1968 had been 8 feet inside my line the entire time. And the document that protected the easement had been recorded in 1971, 50 years before Diane Walcott decided she had jurisdiction over it. The case was won the day my father walked that line with the developer. I just had to keep the paper until somebody with authority finally looked at it. The consequences fell exactly where the overreach had come from, which is the way these things tend to go when the universe is patient. The 12-cabin development died at that hearing and never came back. Because without the easement crossing, there was no road and no utility run and no project. Ridgeline Partners had borrowed against the land, and the project's collapse pulled the financing down with it. Greg Walcott's company filed for protection within the year. Diane was charged in connection with the forged authorization. And while the criminal matter took its own slow road, the homeowners association did not wait. At the next meeting, the same neighbors who had applauded her in August voted her out of the presidency because Frank Delgado played them the recording of her promising legal remedies. And then he played them the recording of 3 strangers cutting an old man's fence with a chainsaw. And people who join an HOA to protect their property values do not like to learn their dues funded a felony. The board that Greg had stacked dissolved under the weight of its own legal exposure. The woman who had tried to take 8 feet of my land by claiming I was functionally part of her community lost the one thing she actually had, which was the gavel. She cut my fence by 8 feet. I did not cut anything of hers. Her own forged permit and her own husband's bad math did that. I just kept the camera on the tree. The fence is back up now. I set the new posts myself last fall, in the same holes my father dug, 8 feet inside the line, exactly where they belong. Sam helped me. He is 15 now and strong enough to swing the post driver, and we worked a whole Saturday in the cold with a thermos of coffee between us, and Gus lay in the grass and supervised. While we tamped the dirt around a post, Sam asked me whether I had ever been scared that summer, and I told him the truth, which is that I was scared the whole time, and that being scared is not the same as being unsure. I knew where the line was. I had walked it as a boy and walked it as a licensed man, and I had the pins photographed in the ground. A man can be afraid and still know exactly where his corner is. The new gate is hung on the same hinges, oiled and swinging clean. Gus still sleeps across the back door like a dropped coat. Beth still works the front desk at the clinic and still sets her keys in the same spot on the counter where her mother used to stand. And in the evening, sometimes I carry a cup of coffee out to the western edge and sit on an upturned bucket and look at the place where my father stood with a developer in 1971 and had the foresight to write a condition into a dedication that nobody read for 50 years. Carol used to say my father trusted paper more than people, and she was not wrong. And I have come to think he was not wrong either. The jars are still on the windowsill catching the morning. Nothing has left its place without a reason. So here is the lesson plain, the way I would tell it to a neighbor across a fence. If somebody in a vest tells you that your land is functionally part of their jurisdiction, do not argue with them and do not pay them. Go to the county and pull your own recorded plat and your own deed and read the metes and bounds and walk the line with a tape until you find the corner pins. And if you cannot find them, hire a licensed surveyor to set them, because a fence is just an opinion until a survey makes it a fact. Read the dedications on every easement that touches your ground, because the conditions written into them 50 years ago may be the thing that saves you. Keep a folder. Write the date in the corner of every letter. Photograph everything and save it to 2 places. And when they finally cross the line from petty to criminal, and the kind of people who do this almost always do not run at them. Keep your head, keep recording, and let the document do the talking in a room full of the right people. The deed does not care how loud anybody is. It only cares whose name is on it and when it was recorded. If you have got a story like this, an HOA or a permit office or a clipboard that decided your property was theirs to manage, tell me about it down in the comments, because I read them and I learned from everyone. If this kind of story is worth your evening, do me a favor and subscribe, because there are more of them, and I am not done telling them. Next time, I will tell you about a woman who tried to charge a man rent on a road his grandfather had deeded to the public in 1940. And what happened when she put up a gate and a toll box on a county right-of-way and a school bus showed up. Until then, keep your records, walk your lines, and know where your corners are. I will see you on the next one.